It's going to be a long-form conversation.
Yeah.
Oh, what? Excuse me?
I'm trying to ask those questions that never end, that are not really questions.
That don't have answers.
Okay.
The question just keeps going on forever and ever.
Are we now?
Yeah, you're live.
Well, great. Okay. So, hello everybody. Welcome to our 12th annual bioregional winter cropping workshop.
Hello.
Hi, Andrew. I'm here with Andrew Still of Adaptive Seed. My name's Nick. I've been a grower for the most part in the southern Willamette Valley for the better part of the last 20 years, and basically began pulling these workshops together. You know how it goes. The best way to learn something, in a sense, is to teach it and to do it. And when we first began pulling these workshops together about 15, 20 years ago, in earnest, I think there was one winter-CSA farm feeding Eugene, which at that point had the highest per capita consumption of organic food in the country, obviously a sort of a major powerhouse in terms of organic farming in our bioregion and of organic food processing. So the territory around the southern part of the Willamette Valley really proved central to the emergence of exploring winter cropping in the Pacific Northwest. And then, of course, we've also, for complicated reasons, been a heartland of the public domain plant stewardship movement. We've got Wild Garden Seed in Philomath, Adaptive Seed in Sweet Home, Peace Seed and Peace Seedlings in Corvallis, and so forth. So some of the foremost crop stewards in the West, as confirmed by the Organic Seed Alliance's decision to host many, if not most, of their early seed trainings in the southern part of the Willamette Valley, sort of has confirmed us as something of a central locus for intelligence about year-round cropping in the Pacific Northwest. I'll just start with a couple of words and then hand over to Andrew. A very familiar mantra as I go out into the world is that the fall and winter harvest season, which I tend to think of as the October, November, December, January, February, March, April, May time frame, is clearly the longest harvest season of the year relative to the spring-summer season. So if we're interested in fundamentally crossing that sort of threshold between playing at becoming an inherently sustainable, long-term food culture, then fall and winter cropping is a crucial element in our vocabulary, in our armory. One of the things we'll be doing today, we tend not to trot out the same shtick each year. One of the things I think we'll be doing today, if we can, is talk a little bit as well, not simply to the specifics of timing and so on and so forth, but to some of our long-term concerns, long-term sort of strategic concerns about trends and developments, for example, in seed breeding, corporate seed breeding, and how it impacts our efforts to create a sustainable bioregional food system, and what we might do together to move that conversation forward coherently. We're certainly going to need to be doing more together in collaboration if we're going to be able to make it work for each one of us as individuals. So, on that note, I think I might hand it over to you, Andrew. Is there anything you would like to say about how would you like to kick things off today?
First question is, are we still using the mics?
Are we?
Because you weren't, I don't know if the sound is coming through well, or is it being picked up on the phone?
Maybe I'll just do a better job of speaking more clearly. There we go. I hope
There
it
we
was
go.
there. All right.
Nick, adjust it one more time so it's
Pointing more directly.
I'm not too used to microphones. Okay.
a little bit better. It's still like
Yeah.
Yeah, me.
Okay. All right. I was great. I was just saying, Andrew, as a former punk rocker, is used to obvious things.
Stop touching it.
Okay. Okay. There we go.
Okay, we're back. Okay, I'm Andrew Still, out of Sweet Home, Brownsville area in Oregon, on the east side of the Willamette Valley. And my wife Sarah and I, we operate Adaptive Seeds, and in the past have also had a vegetable farm and a bean and grain farm. We've worked for other farms for many years, sometimes doing more or less winter production. But there we go. It's always changing however you sit. So one of our goals was to learn as much about winter farming as possible and then try to get as many other people to start doing it, because it is the longest growing season that we have when it comes to the seasons in this area. And we started our farm as a bean and grain farm because there wasn't very many beans and grains available, and then we quickly realized that we weren't the best people to do that because we didn't have the expertise or the land that was appropriate. So we switched to what we thought would be extra fun as an alternative, which is starting a vegetable CSA over the winter. And that's where we decided to trial as many different things as we could possibly grow over winter. And then the stuff that did really, really well, we might add it to our seed catalog, which was something that we did on the side. We found a lot of stuff that grew well. Nick has helped over the years finding cool varieties. My nerdy focus has always been on variety choice. So there's a lot of things to consider when it comes to winter farming and gardening, but the genetics has been the most fascinating aspect to me. Just because I focus on that, don't assume that that's the most important part. There's a lot of moving parts when it comes to growing through the winter, but that's the part I love. So eventually we got out of the growing vegetables business just to strictly do seeds, and that's what we do now. We are 100% adaptive seeds, and we still grow most of it ourselves. Over 80% of the seeds in our catalog is what we grow on our farm, which, because of that, we've had to learn how to grow a lot of these things over winter. So we love to share that information for other people to then experiment with and try, because if we can grow lots more food over the winter, or grow a bunch of food into the fall and then have it sit out in the field through the winter, which is more what happens, then we can all live a more sustainable life and community that feeds itself better and not have to bring it all in from California and other places. So that's why I'm here, and that's why I love winter gardening. I guess we could start talking about what can be done, talk about what's possible, because most people have dabbled in a little winter gardening here and there. Almost everyone has eaten kale, but it'd be cool to know what's possible. Do you want to roll with that, Nick?
Yeah, sure. I think one of the things that I found so interesting about winter cropping in the Pacific Northwest, as it's really picked up in earnest in the last 2 decades, is that it was the gardeners who really first picked up the call in earnest. In the last 4 to 5 years in particular, we've seen a lot more in the way of farms move into this arena. And as a result, a body of experience, particularly as it relates to growing under cover, pick up very markedly. But one of the reasons the gardener's experience is so interesting is that in some senses we haven't been tied so much to economic diktats as much as market gardeners, market farmers have been. And it's afforded us, to a degree, a little bit more license to explore, you could say, eccentric or avant-garde approaches to raising food. One of the things, for example, we found is that as we've moved towards season extension, putting stuff under plastic, what we've discovered is that there's actually a very great deal that can be done at an extraordinarily low-tech level to increase the survivability and palatability and health of crops as we move through winters, for example. It's something we'll be talking to a little bit today, I hope. I think the core discovery or affirmation that we've all stumbled into over the course of the last few years is that we have we tend to think of winter cropping really sort of almost in terms of like 3 separate seasons. The fall to New Year period, the mid-winter period, and in a sense the spring and late spring period. And we target crops into those particular windows and target varieties of particular crop types into those particular windows, or throughout those particular windows. For example, leeks, a classic example of something that can be eaten from the very beginning of the season to the very end of the season. But we have learned that certain crop types have emerged as absolute mainstays, backbones essentially of our winter cropping systems. Foremost amongst them in terms of size, edibility, cold hardiness, and so on and so forth, are the brassicas, the Brassica oeraceae for the most part, and then the Brassica napus, kales, and rutabagas, and so on and so forth. Would you like to speak a little bit to the brassica story? We'll probably, I'll just say, you're likely to hear us talk about kales. I oftentimes I'll say I have absolutely no idea what the future holds for us as a bioregion. But there is one thing I do know for sure, which is that if we are to be a sustainable culture in the Pacific Northwest, then we're going to be a kale culture. I always remember that old woodcut in the Fedco catalogue that shows a group of Cossacks dancing around a kale plant. Wouldn't surprise me if we see a similar sort of aesthetic emerge in our agricultural celebrations in the decades ahead. Do you want to speak to brassicas?
Yeah, so just to think about the big full picture of what's possible and then onto brassicas would be to think about the different plant families, because a lot of them can be grown through the winter. So the big players are the brassicas, of course, which is kale, cabbage, and mustard, and Brussels sprouts, and rutabagas, and turnips, and some salad greens and such. But there's also a lot of other stuff out there that it's good to focus on other things other than brassicas sometimes, because we tend to be over-reliant on them because they work so well. But other things might include the quinopods, the beets and chard and spinach family plants. A lot of them are very winter hardy and tolerate cool, wet climates, which they co-evolved in many times. And we have a cool, wet climate over winter, so lots of chard and beets. Umbels like carrots and parsnips are big, and celeriac, even parsley root, because they grow well throughout the summer here, and then we can store them over winter. Parsley, celery leaf. A lot of these crops we typically think of summer crops, but they do well over winter as well. Another important family would be the alliums, the leeks and garlic and scallions, green onions. There's a lot of really cool kind of chive relatives out there, allium species that are underused, like hundreds of species that we could potentially eat that often grow fine over winter, and you cut them and they grow right back. As a perennial even. But storage onions also feed us through the winter, even though they're not necessarily a winter gardening crop. It's important to think of them as winter food. I guess finally, not limited to the chicory and lettuce, the aster family. We really, really love lettuce. Some lettuces do great into the winter. Also, they do especially well under cover. If you have a small greenhouse or something, they can last all winter here. But we really end up eating mostly through the winter. Instead of kale, which we used to mostly eat, we mostly eat endives and chicories and radicchios through the winter. Just a thing that we've been nerding out on lately. And my own personal taste preference really loves those foods. So alternating between all of that can give you quite a holistic diet throughout the winter. But brassicas are kind of the pillar, and we could talk about that. Definitely, we used to always joke that in our CSA and at our market stand, there was more crops available in our CSA through the winter than there were in the summer. And we added it up, and there was like 10 more crop types in the winter CSA, which was kind of interesting. But that kind of stuff includes some weird stuff like salsify and scorzonera, which are super tasty, but most people haven't eaten. We like to push that stuff too. So as far as brassicas are concerned, the main brassicas that most people know is broccoli. We typically don't consume broccoli into the winter because the florets don't survive in midwinter. But leaves and stems and things like that of the brassicas are great for winter, such as kale, cabbage, mustards. Brussels sprouts are pretty great because they're so hardy and they start to taste really good midwinter. So most of the brassicas, people that don't like to eat kale or Brussels sprouts, the first time they taste a really good kale or Brussels sprout picked post-frost midwinter, they're just, this is not the same food. It's completely transformed.
I should add that one of the reasons it's not the same food, and one of the reasons you'll often see farmers dancing a jig after the first crop comes in, is that the way these plants essentially are designed to defeat them is to deal with the cold, is essentially to pump themselves full of nature's equivalent of antifreeze, which is sugars. Which is why you'll say that, you know, eating a winter-grown carrot or a winter-grown kale simply doesn't compare to its summer cousin.
Yeah, the plant habit of making sugars in the cold as a survival mechanism is quite fascinating. Like, we've even seen winter squashes left out in the shed that after a hard frost, you walk out there and half of them are frosted out and kind of glassy looking, and the other half look perfectly fine. And we've done taste tests, and the ones that frosted in the barn were the ones that tasted bad, didn't have very much sugar. The ones that had tons of sugar were frost resistant in the shed, which is a funny thing to think about. But okay, back to the topic. Brassicas, more brassicas. As a farmer, I was always really excited about kale because it produces so well. But after harvesting hundreds of boxes of kale through the winter, I've actually gotten a little bit not excited about kale and got very, very excited about cabbage, because you can do 2 cuts and throw 2 giant heads of cabbage in a box, and you have 40 pounds of food, where it takes like 10 minutes and frozen fingers to bunch that much kale. So it's definitely an interesting thing to think about. People always neglect cabbage, but cabbage has a lot of positive attributes. And in the winter cabbages, frosted Savoys and January King, those kinds of varieties are so good in the middle of winter and make a summer cabbage taste like cardboard. And there's a lot of diversity in cabbages. Even in the hybrid cabbage world, there's a lot of diversity of hybrids. So I always encourage people to grow more cabbage. And you can overwinter different cabbages and store some. So we typically think of cabbages as maybe 4 different categories. There's the early fast heading up ones for like early spring plantings for your first harvest, like Primax or really fast green cabbages or Red Express. They tend to not taste as good, but they're okay. But then there's main season cabbage and fall cabbage, which taste really good and have better texture. They take a little bit longer to head up. They tend to have more dense heads. Those sometimes can be stored, but also there's varieties of cabbage that are specifically for storage. And you can cut them in October or before frost in September, whenever, and throw them in the root cellar or throw them in a walk-in cooler and have cabbage all winter. They store really, really well. And all you have to do in late winter is just peel off a couple layers of gross leaves and you have a beautiful head of cabbage inside.
And in many traditional cultures, of course, European cultures, much of winter food was actually grown to be dug in late fall and then stored. One of the reasons we simply don't do that here is because for the most part we can keep crops in the field without them freezing out. That said, there comes a point, typically, for example, if you're keeping carrots in the ground, where the attrition rate in the soil in terms of predation and so on and so forth will become a little too much. So you can not necessarily dig your carrots at the beginning of winter, store them in plastic in a cooler, and they will go for months. But you can begin to do it in midwinter. Or, for example, if you sense that a severe weather event is coming in, you can dig your beets, you can dig your carrots, and get them safe and carry them through. Or you can make an effort, for example, to protect them with a mulch, for example. How you make that choice often has a lot to do with whether you have enough storage room or how much you've got in the field, whether it's worthwhile to do it.
Or if moles have undermined all your plants to create superhighways for voles and mice to then eat all your food.
But there are many ways to approach the decision to either keep food in the ground throughout the winter, or to dig at the beginning of winter, or to dig at in midwinter. You make it up as you go along.
Yeah, so I recommend for winter harvest, I recommend planting a few good storage late season cabbages to harvest and throw somewhere that'll store, and then also have a rotation of winter hardy cabbages that you can harvest through the winter. And even some of them, if planted a little bit late, they can head up in January or February, right before they start to bolt, and they are fantastic and tender that time of year. And even in England, they have a variety of cabbage class called spring greens, where they purposefully plant them like that, and the heads aren't solid in the spring, but they're giant and full of this tender, amazingly tasty. They're kind of like almost half-heading collard greens, and super hardy. It's just not normal what people think about when they think of cabbage. So there's lots of those cool things. But definitely think about cabbage, because everyone knows about kale. Brussels sprouts and rutabagas and turnips. These are things that people don't eat very much of, but we could eat more. Most parts of the country are not good at growing Brussels sprouts in a good way, and their harvest, more continental climate, their harvest is very short before they frost out. But we can typically overwinter Brussels sprouts all winter long, and
they're one of the very hardiest of the winter brassicas. Their essential structure, they're designed to shed snow and the worst of the weather. And the primary challenge of raising Brussels sprouts, and you'll hear this sort of recited as a mantra by everybody who grows them, is the way they attract aphid predation as they're being established. I have not grown Brussels sprouts for commercial market. I've grown them extensively through the year after year. I've never found aphid predation ever to stop a Brussels sprout plant maturing Brussels sprouts. If it comes down to the quality of the sprouts themselves, I'm told that early aphid predation can be an issue. But it hasn't stopped me growing Brussels sprouts, and I would encourage it not to let it stop you, particularly as it's something of an agrarian myth that aphid predation is too much of an issue on Brussels sprouts. It isn't. And then there are, if you're growing them at a relatively small scale, there are control mechanisms that you can use. If you're doing it at the garden level, for example, plant your Brussels sprouts somewhere you can spray them down with a hose. Spray off the aphids with a hose. It works.
Works really well. We've had different levels of issues with Brussels sprouts and aphids, and sometimes when in a garden we'll spray them off and they tend to not come back. Other times we'll just wait if it's a moderate infestation. If you can still see the sprouts, it's moderate. But then you can just wait till frost, and then they typically disappear. Otherwise, some other things that we've noticed is that when we've gotten our organic matter and our mineral balances better as soil quality, fertility, and not tons of nitrogen, but enough so they grow vigorously, we have had less issues with aphids in general. They tend to go after weak plants that are either weak because they're super undernourished, or weak because they got way too much nitrogen and not much else. So but then maybe you just have tons of aphids and it's a bad year. It's hard to really say exactly why.
I would also tend to say that Brussels sprouts and cauliflowers in particular tend to be two of the winter brassicas that really seem to like well-balanced soils. If you've got imbalances, nutritive imbalances in your soils, they'll tend to be two of the crops that perform less well than they might otherwise do. I mean, one of the reasons, for example, we tend to insist on kales is not simply because of for example, their incredibly economical habit, their relatively upright growing, the fact that you can harvest off them repeatedly, their maturity window, and so on and so forth. But they also tend to be very forgiving in terms of soil requirements. If you don't get your fertility regimen quite right, you're still going to have kale. They tend to be far more forgiving of montane soils, for example. I would say that if you're, for example, getting into winter cropping for the first time in earnest and you're a little unsure about the quality of your soils, don't invest heavily in cauliflowers and Brussels sprouts.
And if you are having some issues and you want to push through, soil tests can be remarkable ways of knowing how to help your plants grow better. And a lot of places there's a little bit, not enough sulfur available and not enough calcium, or the acidity is a little bit too high. Those kinds of things you get those things balanced, and your kale plant that was growing fine will grow twice as well. So rutabagas and turnips.
Yeah, so when Andrew and Sarah headed over to Europe in the winter of 2006, 2007 on their great sea collecting expedition, one of the things they returned with was some extensive rutabaga genetics. I think at that point there were maybe two and a half varieties that were sort of readily on offer to us. And all of a sudden our access to rutabaga genetics in the Pacific Northwest essentially exploded. One of the reasons it was so interesting was because...
Access goes up and down still.
Access goes up
mostly because of our fault. Not having seed of it.
One of the great lessons from that experience as we began to grow these varieties out was seeing that rutabagas were natural partners to us in terms of winter cropping. One of the things we consistently look for when we are looking at crop types and varieties are populations that don't simply stagger on through to the other side of winter, but actually thrive. And rutabagas are extraordinarily unusual in the sense that not only are they incredibly winter hardy and very nutrient dense, I always joke, I say, you do want to be careful that you don't drop a rutabaga on your foot. You might break a bone. Is that they thrive into our winters. They put on size into our winters, and they handle a lot of the toughness and severity of our winters when they come in very well. So as we've begun to explore winter cropping in depth, one of the things we've learned is that rutabagas are telling us that they want to grow here. So I would say that they're definitely a crop that it's worth exploring. And obviously, if you're considering putting them into a CSA box, the classic thing is you put a kohlrabi into your CSA box, out goes the little leaflet telling people how to use kohlrabi. You might consider doing the same thing with rutabagas. There's a food culture education aspect that we could definitely do better with around rutabagas.
Yeah, so if we can get people to eat more rutabagas and buy more rutabaga seed, then there will be more rutabaga varieties available. It's really hard from experience, any company to have more than one or two varieties of rutabagas in their catalog, because they're not the most popular food, but if you like it, you could find some really cool varieties out there and start saving seed on rutabagas. We could talk about that later. However, there is quite a bit of diversity in rutabagas, and if you're not excited about the rutabaga flavor, some varieties are sweeter than others, and we've done taste tests, and almost every variety has a different flavor profile. Some are very mustardy, almost turnipy, and others are almost like a potato in sweetness with a little bit of cabbagey flavor. It's almost like you could whip it up and have coal cannon potatoes, but without any potatoes. It's pretty. Or we like to throw one rutabaga in with a couple potatoes. We're making mashed potatoes, and it makes everything taste better, including the potatoes. So rutabagas we're almost the next big thing, but they could still be the next big thing.
When do you start rutabagas?
When do we start rutabagas? Timing is a really important concept in winter gardening, and maybe we could go on a slight tangent and talk about them in general. We start rutabagas usually in July. Depends on the variety, depends on the situation, but you can start rutabagas late into August, but they'll just come out really small, and you'll have like 10 little rutabagas instead of one big one. But if you want a giant base, like softball size or baby head size rutabaga, start them definitely in June is usually when we do it.
The same goes for kohlrabi. Kohlrabi needs time to size up. We tend to think of it as a relatively small and modest crop, but it likes among the brassicas to be one of the ones that's seeded on the earlier side of things. However, they do have the advantage, as I said, of being rather unique in the sense that they will continue to put on size and thrive into winters in ways that other crops typically don't.
They're also good raw, like used with a dip.
Yeah.
So our friend over here was just saying that they're also good raw and used as a dip. Okay.
Or grated, with the cheese grater and made into slaw. It's also very good. You can do that with kohlrabi as well. Rutabagas and kohlrabi slaw. That'd be a new slaw for the winter time.
Shall we move into? Do you want to do the quick tangent in terms of timing now, or shall
Sure.
we? Okay. So one of the things that I like to stress as we begin to think of fall and winter cropping is that we're not really talking about distinct seasons, that there's a great deal of sort of interplay in terms of the activities and foods that support us through winters and through summers and so on and so forth, and it can be very difficult to actually sort of draw a line between them all. I mean, I'm not simply thinking in terms, for example, of our storage crops like putting up tomatoes, putting up winter squash, putting up potatoes, putting up garlic and so on and so forth, the crops that we grow typically into the summer and then eat through the winter. But for example, in terms of seeding strategies, leeks, for example, typically we're seeding them early, March and April. If you're wanting large, happy, big leeks ready to go into the winter, you can continue to sow them late, but you can sow them on the early side, the same way you can with parsnips. Oftentimes we'll sow parsnips maybe twice, once in maybe March or April, and then once in July. You'll get smaller parsnips, easier to dig in July, but again, there's no one specific time to be growing parsnips. And then we start to roll into some of the specific requirements relating to timing growing into winter. In some senses, getting your timing right going into winter is easier than it is at any other time of the year. In spring, in the new year and spring, it can often be, there's no clear sense about what the weather's going to be like when you put a seed in the ground, either direct sowing or to produce a transplant ready to put into the ground once you pull it out of a greenhouse, for example. It could be raining all the way through June, for example, and you've got winter squash that you're trying to get into the ground. The other side of the solstice, things are very different indeed. We basically have a very clear sense of when we need to get transplants into the ground. Because every day missed is a day lost, the other side of the solstice, the other side of the equinox.
It's more than a day lost.
More than a day lost.
In an odd way. If you wait a week, you're losing way more than a week.
Way more than a week.
Than you would have before June 21st.
So there's essentially no playing catch up. If you miss a week, you're never going to get it back. It's not like spring where you can play catch up. You miss a week, okay, never mind. Everything's on the rise. You can still sow a week later and you'll be catching up. The other side of the season, it's not like that at all. So seeding dates, or I should say transplanting dates, are absolutely crucial. There's no point seeding at the right time if you then delay getting transplants into the ground a couple of weeks late. So typically we're starting off with our leeks, and then oftentimes in terms of the brassicas, for example, the first ones that we'll be transplanting will tend to be the Brussels sprouts. Generally, they'll be getting transplanted in, we'll be transplanting them in June, for example, typically. And then rolling into the next major wave of fall and midwinter brassicas, the heading brassicas. Typically, we'll be seeding those in June for transplant the last 2 weeks in July. And I should also, now that we're moving into fall crops, say that, for example, you can also be seeding peas, for example, through the last couple of weeks in July for fall harvest. They handle August temperatures very well. And by the time blossoms are coming on in earnest in mid to late September, temperatures are cool enough so that you'll be basically be eating peas all the way into frost. With freezes, they get bitter. Beans, you can basically be seeding. An end of July sowing will basically provide you with beans all the way up to frost. They'll be one of the last pick-me crops that you can eat out of the garden. Yields are lower, but you can still take those all the way into late fall. Potatoes, typically a maturity of 55 to 70 days. So you can basically be seeding you're putting your potatoes in now, and you'll have all of late, maybe August, September, and half of October. And if in the unusual event, for example, that killer frost comes in mid-September, you'll still have oodles of baby potatoes. So these are summer crops, essentially, that you can still be sowing into the fall, never mind the traditional fall crops.
Some of the timing issues that are also important to consider is the variety has a very specific timing. Just saying plant your cabbage now is not necessarily helpful. You want to know what variety you have. So certain Brussels sprouts can be planted in June for a July transplant, but these are only the very fast maturing Brussels sprouts. Most traditional open pollinated Brussels sprouts are planted in April in England and Northern Europe, and they take the whole season to size up. But there are varieties out there that will size up faster than that. So make a note of days to maturity and think about your optimal harvest date and count backwards from there. It's not usually that perfect, but it sometimes can give you a general feel of when to plant things. Some things like overwintering cauliflower and overwintering purple sprouting broccolis, we like to get them big and sized up in really big giant plants so they'll produce boatloads of food in the spring. But if you want them to have slightly smaller heads for filling boxes and being less intimidating at market, you might want to plant them a little bit later, because then they'll make smaller, more reasonable sized heads. If you plant certain crops like brassicas and chicories and things like that later, a little bit on the late side of their planting window, they will often be more winter hardy. They'll survive the winter with less damage, and sometimes you might accidentally do it a little bit too late, or the fall is a little bit too cold and you'll get a really small head or not much harvest, but they will be more likely to survive. It's a little bit of a dance and a risk. It's like, what should I do? When should I plant it? Every fall is so different that it's important to plant a succession of most things, if it's really important to you. That we will often plant the same variety of cabbage or the same variety of heading radicchio. We'll plant it 3 times or 2 times, and hopefully we'll target a couple of those windows. Usually all 3 are fine. Sometimes the first rotation gets really flea beetles or bolts prematurely, or gets too big and rank and frosts out. Or maybe the latter cycle will not head up as well, but still is usually relatively edible. So think about succession sowing going into winter to try to buffer that changing climate that always is a little bit different.
It's essentially the area that holds most in the way of challenge and most in the way of promise is growing the later seeded European and Asian greens typically into a combination of undercover and into the field. If you have the space, we definitely recommend succession sowing. Our falls have always been relatively unpredictable, but they're becoming more so. So that there could be a tendency, for example, to put a crop in a greenhouse and hit hot weather in late fall and find that your arugulas, your Asian greens, your choys, and so on and so forth have actually started to bolt. Oftentimes you'll find that if you're growing at the homestead level, it isn't too much of an issue because the cold weather will, the darkness and the cold will generally come in time to slow that bolting tendency down. But you might have crops that you can't put into a market, but that go very well on the home table. But there is definitely a need, in a sense, to, and essentially one of the core reasons that we try to hit optimal planting dates. It's not that you can't move away from them a little, but what we're trying to do is stack the odds in our favour. And what we found through the years is that the reason we hit these seeding and transplanting dates so specifically is because we find that they most reliably pull off a crop for us. When it comes to growing food and seeding into unpredictable fall weather, there's a very distinct limit to what you can essentially guarantee in terms of pulling off. So one of the reasons we do succession sow there is because we find it's the best way, essentially, to stack the odds so that we're going to produce something that really works well. There are some things that you have to plant early, that you won't get a good crop if you don't. So, like something like celeriac. If you don't give it exactly what it wants, it won't produce that well. But if you do give it exactly what it wants, it will thank you and reward you dramatically. So we like to plant celeriac in the spring to give it a nice long season. But another factor in timing is your soil and your irrigation and your fertility can influence timing dramatically. So something like a celery is a classic example. Most people just water it like they water their normal crops. If you do that, it'll take twice as long to size up. If you give it twice as much water, it'll size up a lot faster. If you give it lots of, like the celery, Apis genus? Apium. Graveolens. Thank you, Chris. It will, if you give it lots of soluble nitrogen and fertility for it to freely grab and go, it will grab it and go. And that's how people get those giant, crispy celeries. You want to balance it. You don't want something super juicy like that going into winter because it will frost out more likely. But if you give it less than what it needs to be vigorous, sometimes these crops will just stop growing and just like hope for a better situation at some point later in their life, which they get depressed and they stop doing everything. But something like a kale or a cabbage, like they usually do okay and they will size up. But there's other things like when it comes to beets, they tend to be sensitive to boron, like lack of boron and other micronutrients. So every plant has its own little personal thing that it needs, and it's good to get to know what kind of timing it has for you. So we love to keep lots of extensive records and show what works. And whenever we say, this worked for us, someone will try it and they'll be like, that didn't work for me. We had 100-degree weather that year and like we left the row cover on and forgot to water and everything died. It's like, well, you didn't do exactly what I did, but it's also like it never is the same any one place. So trying to figure out what works for you and then iterating off of that and learning from other people's mistakes and successes is very important. We have some very simple, basic calendar information on the Pacific Northwest winter farming Facebook group that this feed is coming out of. A very simple timetable from Linda Gilkison up in BC and Vancouver Island that's reliable, and we've also added a few remarks to it in terms of what we found makes sense. We also have the well-known, although rather dated at this point, Willamette winter gardening chart that's available on the Seed Ambassadors website. Or you can pick one up right now if you're here. To massively simplify, what we would basically say is that your primary optimal window for seeding the majority of your winter brassicas are the last 2 weeks in June. And then carrots and beets, 1st of July, for example. One timing thing that is a little bit of an outlier, there's always exceptions to all these things, that we learned it took a couple times seeing it for me to really know, but we plant so many radicchios and endives and escaroles and things like that into winter because it's such good food and sweetens up and is super tasty. But during a hot fall weather
pattern when we had 80 degrees reliably going into the fall. We watered well, we fertilized well, we had 10 varieties, we had 3 successions, but the chicories and the endive species, they just slowed down in the heat. For some reason, they just were like, I don't really like the hot weather. I like it a little bit cooler. And contrary, a lot of other things did a lot better in that hot weather. So like keeping an eye out for what different crop types and crop species, how they react to different situations can be quite eye-opening, and there's always something to learn. So write this stuff down when you learn things and share it with people, and it's always a good conversation.
Yeah, and given that we're already mid-July, obviously there's a limit in terms of what's optimally a good idea in terms of seeding from here on in. I would certainly say, don't delay on seeding a lot of your leafy brassicas, for example. They'll be smaller plants, but you're not really challenged by the prospect of getting something to head up into the fall at this point. You don't want necessarily to be seeding your fall cabbages at this point, or your fall broccolis with a great degree of reliability. That said, in terms of the whole array of European and Asian greens and vegetables, I'm thinking about the choys, the mizunas, the tatsoys, the mispunas, arugulas. Spinaches are an extraordinarily hardy winter crop, and we've got a lot of choice of material there that's well suited to be, for example, getting grown outside and also to be grown under cover. And there's still plenty of time to be getting that into the ground if you're looking to do that. Again, we've got some specific information certainly in this guide about when it's best to sow specific crop types. But one of the things you can generally think of is that you'll be aiming at, for example, the latter part of August to be direct seeding, for example, a lot of those crops. And then also perhaps, but you'll be transplanting probably your endives and your chicories and your escaroles and your frises at that point. So there's still plenty of room, and even, for example, if you don't quite get to things, for example, favas, traditionally in the southern part of the Willamette Valley, we'll generally sow them around the 15th of October. Any earlier, oftentimes, and you have plants that tend to be a little bit more susceptible to heavy snow. Any later, and generally you're having crops that don't really sort of size up in earnest. But after some experience myself of raising fava seed crops into winters and being crushed a couple of years in succession, it tended to move me to starting to seed my favas in February. So generally I'm growing my favas in February. They come on 3 weeks later than fall-seeded favas, but I'm eating their tops in the early part of the year, and I'm still getting healthy favas with almost no risk of losing a crop. Garlic, traditionally, it's something that's seeded in this part of the world in October. But some farmers seed in September, and they generally end up with very large heads. Some other farmers seed in February, their garlic in February, and it works for them, slightly smaller, but it also works. So we do have flexibility in terms of, major sort of flexibility in terms of when we come at some of these very significant crops.
Should we talk about what we can still get away with now?
Yeah, let's do that.
So this, the date of this workshop is unfortunately a little bit too late for most things. It's a hard thing to always remember because we're always rushing really hard to get our gardens and farms going in for summer production, and then right when you're like starting to feel like you're getting on top of things, it's like, oh, I'm late on planting my fall stuff, which is if you're already struggling with a summer vegetable CSA, the last thing I would recommend is start a winter vegetable CSA on top of it, because your life will be consumed and be super stressful immediately. But if you can add it to your current stuff without too much disruption, do it. It's awesome. But what we can still do now is mostly almost any of the salad greens are very easy to get away with now, such as Asian vegetables and like greens and pak choys and mizunas, and also arugula and spicy mustards and stuff like that can definitely go. There's a lot more time than we can get away with, even into September. And if you have a greenhouse, you can hold them all through the winter and plant them even later. It's a little bit pushing it for beets and fall broccolis, but there might be some opportunities there. Overwintering broccoli, you can plant them now, but you better not dally. It's if you don't get them going by late July, they will probably not even size up enough to be worth it. Another miscellaneous green would be buckshorn plantain. That one's fun and unique and weird, but it's quite winter hardy. You can plant that through August, I think, but they could use more experimentation. Some things that are a little bit getting to the limit is cabbage, even for overwintering. Our fall storage cabbage and overwintering cabbage, we often will plant on the same time because the overwintering cabbage does take a little bit longer to size up. It tends to store less water in it, so it takes a little bit longer to go and size up than the other ones that are super juicy and watery, which size up faster. Carrots, it's getting a little bit late. You can still plant some carrots, some faster carrots that you harvest when they're little, maybe, but the big honkin' chantenays and winter like storage types might be approaching a little bit too late for that. Radicchio and chicories, it's right now is a great time to go. We started all ours last week, but you can start them this week, next week, and still get a good crop. Some of the smaller types, like the grimolos, the little button and like rosette kinds, you can plant them even later because they'll size up and you harvest them when they're small anyways, and they typically don't get that big. Some things like those grimolo or castelfrancos, if you plant them late, they often won't size up for November or December harvest, but they'll put on a ton of growth in February, April, March, that kind of period when right before they're about to start bolting. They're really a great, they put on a lot of mass during that time of year, which I think is an underused aspect of the loose leaf chicories and radicchios.
The same goes for lettuces. The lettuces that you'll find sizing up in early to mid-spring are enormous and very happy indeed.
If you don't plant Castelfranco, you're crazy. I'm just going to say that as a universalized judgment. Cilantro, you can plant cilantro, and a little bit later, and it won't bolt. And if you can plant them late, they'll size up into the fall and be bolt resistant and taste fantastic into the winter. Cilantro is quite winter hardy, and people don't realize it. And sometimes in the winter, we'll just eat like cilantro salads because it tastes so nice. And
yeah. It adds an extraordinary touch to a winter. And it's a classic example as well in many ways of how, for example, seed. The Willamette Valley is a global centre for seed growing, particularly brassicas that require vernalisation. And seed breeders will typically, if they're growing a cabbage crop, will start them later, growing the plants into winter smaller, which generally tends to increase the survivability. There was an adage in the old days that you really didn't want to be starting your winter crops too early because you didn't want them too big going into the winter because they might be more susceptible to damage. What we found is that really doesn't, for the most part, hold.
Occasionally it's important, but not always.
As a general rule, we're wanting to get our brassicas as sized up as we can going into the winter. Seed growers, it's a little different for them. But cilantro is a classic example of how staggered sowings of cilantro will give you huge plants, happy plants, going into the fall, early part of the winter, that you can readily harvest off. And a later sowing, smaller, will be much hardier in terms of surviving winter weather. So if there's one winter green, I would definitely suggest starting with succession sowing. It would be cilantro, particularly because it's such an extraordinary... I mean, I remember the first time I discovered that cilantro survived with the winter. It was walking through a field of summer crops and suddenly finding my nostrils full of the smell of cilantro and looking down at my feet and finding that the summer crop had not only survived but was thriving. And I was like, my goodness, I had no idea. cilantro is that hardy and remarkable.
And if you plant them a little bit too early, bolted cilantro stems are pretty tasty. Just chop them up small and eat them just like regular cilantro. We as seed growers, we've planted lots of rounds of cilantro seed, and we plant it really early in the spring. And that springtime sowing is long enough so they'll then bolt and have a long enough season to produce a large, high quality, lots of seed. But you usually drop a bunch of seeds when you're harvesting it, and that next season, like going out there in the springtime where the cilantro seed crop was, there's always beautiful, perfect cilantro plants in the beds adjacent to and in the one that you had it in. There's just something about that like I think that they want to overwinter, and the plants get gigantic when they overwinter. So cilantro is great and underrated. It's a little late to start celeriac and celery. I wouldn't bother. Overwintering cauliflower and collards, those other brassicas, it's getting a little late, but you could probably still try it and maybe have success depending on the weather.
And one of the things also to keep in mind is that for example, there's a certain class of cows, we call them the hunger cat cows, that have been selected through the centuries not to really be particularly impressive performers through the first and mid part of the winter, but that in spring put on a huge amount of growth. Is Pentland Brigg probably one of our finest examples of that hunger cat cow? Or?
Pentland Brigg is pretty good. Yeah. I would say other varieties that have a more broadleaf tend to be more vigorous and produce more food, something like a Madeley, or if you can get your hands on asparagus or thousand-headed kale, or those kinds of kales. Sutherland kale is an example where they're kind of weird, but in the spring they just go crazy. And there's a variety of red Russian kale, which is called Russian hunger gap kale, that we found in England, that goes to seed. It bolts a full 2 to 3 or more weeks later than the common red Russian types. And it's called red Russian hunger gap because it produces food through the hunger gap longer into the spring when there's very little to be eaten in the garden. So
even as your cows might be smaller going into the winter, seeding them at this point, nevertheless you can expect a very abundant harvest the latter part of the spring. The same also goes for, to a degree, for chard. It's late to be starting chard. Typically what we're finding is that chard's becoming increasingly problematic to grow in our bioregion. A lot of people now are recording heavy black aphid infestation on chard, for example. This is a new bug coming in on the chards, as well as obviously the leaf miner. But one of the reasons chard is unique, in a sense, in our annual cropping system is that it occupies almost single-handedly a late spring sort of 2-week window when everything else, basically every other meaty green, has run to seed and has basically done its thing, and it's before anything really substantive that's been sown in midwinter or early spring has sort of come on for you. Fills that window as nothing else does. It's sort of totally alone and totally unique. So even as, and as most of you are probably aware, chard plants can get quite huge and can produce an enormous amount of food in late spring. It's one of the reasons, for example, why I will tend to grow chard both outside and under cover. It's one of the few plants I make a specific point of doing that with, because if I lose my outside chard to heavy weather, typically one of the things that will really crush chard will be standing snow. It just melts it for the most part. There's a lot of crops will bounce back. Chard often won't. But if I have it in a greenhouse and can protect it under a greenhouse, I know that I'm still going to have it producing a huge amount of leaf matter right in that window when nothing else is, for the most part.
It's always good to look for what varieties of chard and other stuff like kale, what they do in the face of distress of going through the winter refrigerator period or Persephone period, and then see what they do in the spring. Like, don't just, like, I have a story of, there's a variety of Castelfranco out there that's really pretty and really, like, gorgeous in the fall, and it tends to not look as good in the middle of winter, but then it gets better in the spring. And the variety that we sell, doesn't look as pretty in the fall, but in the middle of winter, it looks really, really pretty. And really the two differences there is that I think that these two different Castelfrancos that probably came from the same genetic stock 10 years ago have been selected for 10 years to look great in that window of the winter. And it only takes like 3 generations of really selecting something hard to really change that in a plant, because that something like Castelfranco has a lot of genetics to change with. So if you really want something to do well, you might have to do it well yourself, or do it for what your particular needs are. Kale is a really weird example when it comes to that. Like Madeley kale, a big broadleaf kale from England, puts on an incredible amount of food into the fall. And then after first frost, most of those leaves are like dead and hanging, and the plant's still going to sit there as this little rosette of a plant, and then doesn't really grow much in the winter. And then in the spring, it takes off and goes crazy. It's like this, it produces really well in the fall and the spring and always survives, but it's like, oh, it's not my job to produce leaves in the winter. No one told me that was my job. Something like white Russian kale from Frank Morton's breeding work. It's great because it produces a ton in the fall, but it goes completely dormant all winter long. And then in the springtime, it goes crazy again and produces a ton of food. And my hunch is that because that particular kale had been stewarded at Gathering Together Farm in Philomath, where it floods, the fields flood every winter, and almost everything dies, but the white Russian kale would survive, because there was something about that white Russian kale that went dormant and like had resistant to wet feet over winter. So if you have wet soil, that might not grow stuff in the winter, but the white Russian kale will survive going into the spring. Whereas something like a Western Front or Russian Hunger Gap kale doesn't go dormant through the winter and just keeps producing more leaves and more leaves and more leaves. But if the weather gets really, really bad, it might be more susceptible to damage. So it's good to, different crops and varieties have different weird behaviors like that.
Yeah, and I think Andrew's speaking to one of the great lessons that we've certainly picked up through the years. Common sense, of course, but it's nice to see it experientially confirmed, which is that diversity, not only in terms of crop types, but of varieties within crop types, is important. Typically, for example, you'll find around kales, for example, one of the interesting aspects of life in the southern Willamette Valley is that we've been a heartland of the public domain plant breeding movement for the last 2 to 3 decades. And these plant breeders have been eating out of local landscapes and focusing very extensively on kales. To all intents and purposes, the southern Willamette Valley has been the global heartland of, certainly in the English-speaking world, of kale genetics, both in terms of the Oleracea and in terms of the Russo-Siberians, for some time. And what we've found is that it's given us a great deal of material to grow and to look at. And typically, what we find is that we might settle in on, 6 or 7 or 8 favorite varieties, and you'll find one that's absolutely bulletproof year after year, and then after 4 or 5 years, all of a sudden it's not performing. Typically what we'll find is that individual varieties tend to excel in individual years, and just because one variety is excelling one year doesn't mean it's going to do so well the next. There's that general pattern. We also have different patterns in terms of, for example, maturities. We've already talked about the hunger gaps. Some kales are very well suited to producing a lot of material at the end of the season rather than mid-season. We've also got huge diversity in terms of textures, flavours, and particularly of late, colours. A lot of pinks are coming in and reds are coming in, and I know that, Chris, you're developing some extraordinary perennial material of late that has dizzying colour palettes. So if you thought you knew kales, check out the varieties that are being offered by the likes of Adaptive Seed and Wild Garden Seed, and then to a degree Uprising. There is a dizzying palette to choose from. It amazes me that I haven't seen bouquets of kales being offered, of different varieties of cut kales being offered at market. They're exquisitely beautiful. and incredibly eye-catching, and we've got a lot of diversity that hasn't really been made a lot of yet, or could well be made a lot more of.
Okay, back to what we can do now. We're not going to talk about kale anymore. Promise. Parsley. Okay, I'll get to that later. Okay, in alphabetical order, corn salad is something that people tend to not grow much of, but in Europe they grow a lot of it, and they've got a really cool production method to do that. It is incredibly winter hardy, even though each little plant isn't that much food. If you plant 100 of them, you got a lot of salad. Cress, such as upland cress, is a really hardy crop and always just grows bulletproof through the winter and never cares, but it doesn't taste that great in my opinion. If someone can help me with that, I'm open to changing. It can't be helped.
Mix it with other stuff.
Mix it with other stuff. That's a great way to sneak good stuff in. Endive and escarole. I am convinced that escarole, broadleaf endive, is the most underutilized crop, undergrown crop that could be huge and everyone could be super excited to eat. They are super hardy, they have tons of food, they're like crunchy walnut flavored lettuce that usually goes deep into the winter and is super good.
And tends to be more resistant to predation, except for gophers. Their root systems tend to be more susceptible, but in terms of slug predation, for example, they do far better than most other greens.
Fava beans, we talked about that. You can plant them usually in October or in the spring if you got good, well-draining soil. You might be able to get away with a late planting of fennel. It's getting a little bit close to the deadline there.
And it also tends to be the first crop to succumb to even a light frost. If you have the threat of a frost coming in, dig your fennel.
And some varieties will die back and then re-sprout in the spring, and you get a bunch of little mini fennels in the springtime. Some varieties, like the giant bulbing types and the hybrids, have never been selected for that, and they'll just die and go away. But if you have that little bit smaller sized fennel, certain varieties, like Florence fennel, the more generic types, strangely enough, will tend to regrow a second year. And wild types, but they don't produce quite as good of a bulb, but they're still pretty tasty. Salad greens, or kale as a salad green. Oops, I said it. You could plant it now and get some smaller plants. Need that.
It tends to be a little difficult grown as a sort of a microgreen in greenhouses. It tends not to perform so well. But you've got that into specific kale cross, gulag stars, for example, which is extraordinary under cover in greenhouses.
Well, there's generally the Brassica napus species kale, red Russian, Siberian, a bunch of other different interspecific crosses that are still mostly napus. They tend to be more vigorous and grow fairly well, whereas the Oleracea kales are mostly good for bunch greens. There's always exceptions to that. Kale is always going to be there. Lettuce, you can plant lettuce late, and depending on the variety, heading lettuce, you might have to time it better to get a good head. But salad mix lettuce, they're much more forgiving, cut and come again style, or multiple cuts of loose leaf and oak leaf lettuces. Certain varieties tend to be more winter hardy than others. It really depends on the variety, and it's hard to say one or the other. My typical go-to that I always recommend is winter density. It does well in the heat. It does well in the winter. It's nice and sweet and crunchy. It's kind of like a great all-around lettuce that all other winter lettuces should be measured against.
And just because a variety has winter in its name doesn't really mean too much. So do be alert to that.
If it has Arctic in its name, it has nothing to do with cold. I think it might be crispy or something. They just like it's crispy like ice, even though it doesn't have any cold resistance whatsoever. When it comes to lettuce and the varieties and the timing and all of that, it really is variety is important, but also what diseases you have and airflow issues. Like lettuce is super, super hardy. It almost never dies from frost. It always dies from a little bit of damage that gets infected by a fungus or bacteria or some other kind of rot that'll take it down. One way of mitigating that is choosing disease-resistant varieties or finding them with trialing, or also harvesting the outer, older leaves first and letting the new growth come back in will often extend the harvest for lettuces, or putting them under cover. Row cover tends to exacerbate the rot sometimes because it stays so damp and humid under there, but plastic greenhouse can, even an open-ended hoop house with even the sides rolled up, just to keep the rain off of the lettuce will go through the winter no problem.
I disagree.
You disagree?
I tend to. I have a small prejudice.
Controversy.
Against lettuce. I typically find them far more disease susceptible than many of the other greens. I mean, one of the reasons I generally grow spinach, arugula, mizunas, mispunas densely in thick beds is because they're so relatively disease free. I can pack them in tight, create thickets of food, harvest off them repeatedly, and be relatively confident that they're not going to get diseased. Lettuce it seems to me to be far more fussy and require far more space. Now, that's a subjective opinion. There'll be people out there with experience who'll disagree, but that's the way I see it. So.
Other people, like Sarah, my wife, doesn't like eating lettuce very much, unless it's in a BLT. So other greens, here's a fun one that we've been eating a lot recently is miner's lettuce. If you can get a good source of miner's lettuce seed, we used to carry it, but we're in the process of growing it back again, getting the new lot in cleaned. But miner's lettuce is quite good and produces a fair amount of food in the springtime, especially when it was starting to regrow right before it goes to seed. Super winter hardy. Mustard greens, spicy mustards, Brassica juncea. There's a lot of really cool diversity in there, underutilized because of the spiciness. They tend to mellow out a little bit in the winter, but some varieties tend to stay spicy. We like certain varieties like Piso or Green Wave or Frizzy Lizzie or Green and Snow. Certain varieties like that tend to be a lot hardier than others. Some it's really kind of hard to predict what varieties will survive winters or not. One variety called Dragon Feathers Mix, I saw that growing at Wild Garden Seeds a couple years ago, and he grows a lot of his mustards over winter and selects hard for the ones that don't do well. So if it's been selected to overwinter, it'll probably overwinter better than something that is a more common, less hardy variety.
And I should interject at this point. You heard me say earlier that farmers have moved into winter cropping in the Pacific Northwest in earnest in the last few years. And one of the areas they've really pushed ahead and where there's a great deal of room for novel experimentation relates to growing undercover. So I just got in touch with Jen Sadiq, who's one of the core farmers at Sophie Island Organics, one of the mainstay farms serving Portland, who's pushed. I spent years trying to persuade her to grow greens into winter, and she resisted. And now, of course, she's turned into an absolute pro in the field. And she told me, I asked her, all right, what are you growing into greenhouses in the winter? And here's a list. She said, Mizuna, Ruby Streaks, Golden Frill, Arugula. She's heavy on wild garden seeds. They're mild mustard blend, they're frilled dragon mix, they're chicory mix, they're pungent mustard mix. A variety of spinaches, we'll speak about those in a little bit. Tatsoi, choys, wrinkled cress, honvit, the radish, giant red mustard and green wave mustard. And she's made, has a lot of success growing those beds extensively, direct seeding late August for the most part, when she's transplanting her last wave of head of lettuces, for example.
If you're not super into the super spicy mustards, as far as the flavor, a lot of people don't like the super. It's almost like some of them taste like you're just eating wasabi. If you cook them briefly or ferment them into a pickle or like a kimchi, they tend to mellow out a lot, and that flavor becomes, it doesn't go away altogether, but it becomes somehow more palatable and makes everything pop. I really like to grow green in snow, which is the Chinese variety. I think it's Shi Li Hong. I think it's the original name for it, but it is definitely green in snow. We like ripped up a bunch of plants and left them in the grass one winter because we're cleaning out of bed, and like they survived just sitting on the grass, uprooted all winter long. It's an amazing weird plant. Super winter hardy, and tastes way better when it's cooked or fermented because it is hot. Mustards, Brassica rapa, the less pungent, more sweet flavored mustards such as Mizuna and Tatsoi and bok choys. A lot of those Brassica rapa mustards like bok choy do really, really well in covered situations going into winter. They produce really well, and it's like the exact environment that they like. You can get giant, like basketball-sized baby bok choys going into winter that way. Not so baby. Do you have any of your favorite varieties of rapa greens?
I don't.
You just like them, or you
Well,
generally?
I was just thinking, getting into the Kitazawa seed catalogue is, I did it in earnest some decade ago, but it's like worth another exploration. I should also say that it's a bit of a red flag to raise here, but one of the things we do need to be a little alert to, and I think we'll get into this in the latter part of our discussion today, is that many of the varieties coming to us out of Japan are hybrids, are genetically modified. We're facing this challenge in
Not classic GMOs, but
classic GMOs.
definitely suspect.
Well, what we find is that the classification GMO is not actually a scientific classification in this day and age, it's a political classification. So one of the things that to keep in mind is that some of the most impressive varieties that are being made available to us now for winter cropping might be problematic in terms of an ethic, but we can maybe get into that a little bit in terms of the end of our discussion today.
Well, just to clarify, so it's not hanging too much, is most of this material, the new hybrids, are cytoplasmically male sterile. They've been manipulated to have the genome, the nuclear genome, and the cytoplasmic genome of two different species spliced together, and that makes them not make pollen, which then helps them make the hybrids. So it's a tool to create hybrids more economically, and it also has the ability to make it nearly impossible to save seed in a way to recover the maternal half of the genes. So half of those hybrid seeds is proprietary to the company, and you'll never be able to restore that fertility to get those genes out of that into another variety if you're doing a plant breeding project. So traditionally, male sterile the fertility could be restored, but the cytoplasmic male sterility that's done by cell fusion is not. And that's why it's problematic from a more like seed saver future, like not having a corporation have complete control over the seed. That's why it's a problematic.
And this was an issue that we began running into right from the very beginnings of our efforts to identify and secure what we sensed as a sustainable genome to carry us as a culture through winters in the Pacific Northwest.
And it is a very common technique that the big corporate breeders use in brassicas specifically, and also in a couple other crops.
You had a question?
Does Kaylet fit into this, what you're speaking of, Kaylet?
Kaylet is, I think, just a simple kale Brussels sprout hybrid from Tozer's, and to my knowledge, they don't use cell fusion.
Okay.
Certain breeders do.
But it is PVP?
It's plant protection.
So it is a kind of patented variety.
It's a
Yeah.
utility patent, so you can no longer, it's very dangerous. Could you guys speak to utility patents as well?
We could talk about that
Let's talk
later.
Let's talk about it a little
That's
later.
a nice rabbit hole.
And the reason this suddenly surfaced is that I've been carrying Mizuna populations for years. I'm very into Mizunas and developing essentially the equivalent of a local land race, and been trying to get red genetics into my Mizuna for years. And then all of a sudden, a couple of years ago, a Mizuna turned up that was extraordinary in terms of its colour and its hardiness and its morphology. I mean, it was just, it was like one of the most impressive varieties of any crop type I've ever encountered. And I thought, well, that looks a little suspect to me. So I started asking questions and found out that it basically came out of a Japanese breeder who's probably one of the most renowned companies in the world in terms of using hybrid technology to develop material. So the likelihood of it being a hybrid it's almost like 100%. So what I was confronted with was my favorite variety is, as far as I'm concerned, a genetically modified organism.
It's also an evolutionary dead end in a way. It's kind of the original idea of Terminator technology in plants, but only half of the genome is terminated. There are a lot of really cool varieties coming out of Japan, not as much as the new stuff, but some of the older heritage varieties that are very good. Japanese breeders have been quite excellent in their quality and choices of breeding work so we actually carry a number of stuff, and we encourage other people to look into it. It's mostly a concern with hybrids, and it is mostly a concern with the big industrial focused hybrids for there's a few European companies that do it with cauliflower and broccolis, for example. A lot of heat resistant traits in broccolis are not recoverable because of the male sterility. So
Sun Gold, by the way, is a Japanese variety, a cross made in Thailand. Not a winter crop, but I'm just saying it's a superb variety.
But it's not not problematically bred.
Yeah.
Interesting
little tangent.
Where were we? Kohlrabi. You might be able to get away with a little kohlrabi if you planted it now, but if you planted the giant kohlrabis like Giganta and my favorite super schmells, they won't size up very big, but they might stay. You might get something. But get it in quick if you're going to try that. We carry super schmells, and it's always been the most hardy. Goes through winter. It almost 1 year got down to 5 degrees, and most everything died, including cabbages and kales, and the kohlrabi survived. It's weird. Lettuce. We talked about lettuce. Miner's lettuce. We already got. I didn't turn the page. I'm cheating. I'm reading my notes. Overwintering onions. That's kind of an underrated winter crop, but you can plant onions in August, September, and sometimes they'll overwinter well and not bolt, and you can eat the tops through the winter if you want to sacrifice some of the bulbs.
There's been a greater tendency for them to bolt in the spring in recent years with the more erratic weather that we've been having.
Also, Walla Walla onions haven't been selected very hard in recent past for resistance to bolting from overwintering planting. Some of the Japanese varieties actually are highly resistant to bolting and need a long vernalization period as a bulb. So look into that. The traditional Walla Walla overwintering onion might not be the best choice for overwintering, but sometimes it works. There's pak choys, Chinese cabbage. I really like Chinese cabbage. You can often cut it Napa cabbage and store it in the cooler over winter, and it'll last a long time. We like to throw them in a couple perforated plastic bags and throw them in the woodshed, and they'll sit there for 2 months, no problem, as long as it's not a hot climate winter. Parsley. Chris was wanting to talk about parsley. It is far too late, in my opinion, to plant parsley, but if you plant it in April through mid-May, definitely get some nice big plants, and parsley's quite
and there's
hardy.
And there's actually quite a broad degree of sort of varieties that are available in parsley too, both in the wrinkled and the flat leaf. Lots to explore, and some of them are truly exceptional.
If you want a nice hardy parsley that produces a lot of food, I recommend Einfachschnitt. It's a great German variety.
Bless you.
Too late for parsnips, too late for parsnip. You might be able to plant a parsnip and get like a little carrot version of a parsnip by fall.
Easier to dig in.
Sometimes you can
in
just
heavy
pull
soil
them out of the
cities.
ground without having to dig when they're planted late. But
Yeah.
one thing about parsnips right now is not a good time to plant parsnips with this weather. They typically like the weather to be lower than in the 80s or lower Fahrenheit. So once it gets in the 90s, they don't tend to germinate very well. And then it makes the irrigation you have to irrigate them like every day or two for 2 weeks or more to get them to sprout. And it makes it really hard to irrigate them when it's 100 degrees out. So if it is 100 degrees, you might want to just not bother. Radishes, that's something that we should be planting now and into August, maybe into September for overwintering, or bunching radishes. There's 2 kinds of radishes. The bunching radishes that everyone typically eats, they'll go into winter fairly well sometimes. But really, my favorite for winter gardening are the winter radishes, surprisingly. Blauer Herbsta is a giant, kind of giant carrot-looking radish that's bright magenta colored. It will grow through the winter, and you can dig them and store them in your root cellar. Sometimes they'll survive. Daikons is another crop that's good to dig and store. Sometimes they overwinter. Also, black radishes. People think of black radishes as black Spanish, but throughout Northern Europe, into like Lithuania and Latvia, they eat a lot of black radish through the winter. And it's a great storage radish, and it has a unique kind of flavor and characteristic. Rutabaga, we covered rutabaga. Salsify and scorzonera are super winter hardy, and scorzonera is even perennial, and you can eat the leaves. Pretty tasty, but it is a little bit late to size up. You want to plant that in the spring. Sorrel is another unbelievably hardy, never fails kind of crop, but once you get a little patch of sorrel, you don't really need much more. It's pretty potent, but it's a really tasty crop and lots of vitamin C and makes good soup. Spinach. Nick wants to talk about spinach. That's a big one. We struggle with spinach because we have some phylums that like to target spinach, but also the erratic weather can trip up spinach. But if you do a trial and find some of your own good windows, spinach can be a really healthy, good crop. And there are varieties that thrive from a spring planting, and there are other varieties that thrive from a fall planting. And we found from a trial this year that all the winter types, winter giant, verdil, Belgian winter, a lot of the winter type giant leaf spinaches produced an insane amount of food from a spring planting, but didn't taste very good. But from a fall planting going into winter, they also produce an insane amount of food, and they taste really good. So just maybe having taste in your trials can influence what you plant when as well.
Yeah, spinach was one of the great surprises in terms of my early trialing, finding out just how extraordinarily cold hardy it was, a crop that survived where so many other crops will go down. Varietal selection is crucial for fall and winter cropping. Typically we're looking at plants that are very different to their summer cousins. Spinach is no different. Typically we've got 2 basic types, the types that we grow outside and the types that we grow under cover. The types that we grow outside, the Bloomsdale series, tend to be very low to the ground and can survive being, can survive snow load and will generally go through snow load and emerge the other side quite happily. The old sort of standard axiom that snow insulates crops is not generally something that I've found holds up. Typically I find it destroys crops more than insulate them. Spinach seems to be a little bit of an exception.
In our climate,
Yeah.
snow only lasts for a week or so, and when it comes and goes so fast, it tends to be a problem more than a help.
Yeah.
If you have snow that sticks around for a month or two, it then might insulate from really bad weather. But
And then in greenhouses, we can, or hoop houses, we can grow spinaches where the structure of the plant is not so much an issue. We're not looking at a plant that needs to survive getting crushed by weather. So you can really go for the large-leaved varieties. Verdil being a classic example, an OP variety out of where is it? Switzerland, I don't know.
Verdil is from, I believe, Bingenheim. a biodynamic plant breeding company in Germany.
Yeah, and it's consistently produced vast amounts of food for me into and out of winters.
When do you usually sow your winter spinach?
I'm generally doing it in August and September for the most part, transplanting late September, early October. Typically I'm putting in 4 or 5 seeds into a cell to transplant.
Yeah, we've had a lot better luck with transplanting spinach than direct sowing. Not really sure why, our own situation probably, but if you can get good soil mix that spinach will germinate in, transplants work perfectly fine.
And I don't know the story around bolt resistance in open pollinated spinach development, but it doesn't seem to be particularly impressive. But it's not an issue growing spinach into fall and through winters for the most part, or at least I haven't found it to be. And where, 6 or 7 years ago we had maybe 1 or 2 OP varieties of spinach readily available, that was all that was sort of left to us. In recent years, far more has come to us. So we've got more in terms of availability and diversity, and if you move into hybrids, incredible differences in terms of habits and colours and flavours and textures and so on and so forth. So I'd definitely say it's a mainstay for me. I like to grow it outside. Obviously I can plant large beds where space is more limited. I plant it very densely and thickly, and will grow it in a very thick bed and harvest off it repeatedly through a winter.
Okay, so Swiss chard, we talked about that a little bit already, but you might be able to plant it into August under cover. I usually try to plant it by July myself. But
There seems to be a lot of a huge swathe of hardiness in terms of a spectrum of hardiness in terms of chard varieties. Typically in the old days, it always used to say 4 to a giant was a little bit of a mainstay for me, but these days it's all over the map. So if you can find a variety, settle in on it and save seed, you'll be doing well.
yeah, and a good start would be to find farm direct seed for something like most things, but especially chard. Someone who's been growing chard in the Pacific Northwest and overwintering it here, that typically is, we find to be much more hardy than something that was produced in mass in Europe or in California or some more generic varieties. So definitely there's a huge opportunity there. A lot of fun has been had by taking 10 or 15 varieties of chard, planting them all together in a garden or a farm bed, letting them flower, the ones that survive, and then saving seed off of that and having your own rainbow chard mix. Sometimes it'll turn mostly white, sometimes it'll turn mostly red. It's like really depends on what survives, but sometimes it'll stay rainbow, and that tends to be the stuff that survives and thrives in our climate, and it's a fun, easy project, more of a landrace selection method.
Okay. That also might be a good in terms of the beginnings of a segue towards this deepening concern we have relating to locally adapted winter hardy material. Do you want to just finish off in terms of talking about turnips? Or
Turnips. Turnips are good. I don't eat tons of them, but when I do, I'm like, oh, turnips are pretty good. I never seek them out, but I should. Different turnips like Tokyo Market and the white turnips tend to not be as hardy. They like to be pampered, even though they taste so good. They might be worth the effort. But when it comes to winter turnips, I like to focus on the purple top types, or something like a 3-root Grex from Peace Seeds, like a crossed up population of turnips. We have a variety called Aprovecho Hardy turnip, which we selected from Peace Seeds variety after 80-90% of a bed of turnips died over winter because of the cold. We went and picked the ones that were left at Aprovecho. Our friends were living there, and we planted them in our yard and have been growing that as stock seed and overwintering them ever since. And those turnips are clearly more hardy than a lot of other stuff we've sown. So it's another example of diversity as a tool to increase hardiness. And one thing is if you are going to be doing a wide crosses like that, always remember to select for flavor and quality, because sometimes when you have a population like that, the main selection pressure is survival. Sometimes they can go wild or feral or kind of not so tasty or wonky. So look out for that.
Yeah. A question.
Well, a comment. You didn't really mention collards very much.
Yeah.
We grow a variety called yellow cabbage collards that comes from North Carolina. The only place I think the seed is available is from Southern Exposure. We've been saving it. The seed lasts for like 5 years, so we probably saved it 3 or 4 times. And I do want to start again because we grow so many brassicas. I think other stuff is creeping in. But they're big. They're so much tastier than other collards. They're actually really delicious in summer. We plant a crop in March, transplant a crop in March, and then another one in August. And both of them go through the winter. The March planted ones a lot of them tend to get aphid, and we give them to the chickens.
So
But
March is a good collard planting for like a spring and summer harvest kind of
Well, and
then they do last into
last
winter. Okay.
Just every bit as well.
Yeah. We've
And
took
the other thing I
yeah.
would say about that particular variety is when it was 6 degrees 3 nights in a row at our farm and all our other outside greens died, the collards were like, we don't care.
And yellow cabbage collards especially?
Cabbage collards, yeah.
Okay, so
That's the only
that's
kind
good
of growth
information,
we've had,
yeah.
so I don't know how others would have done in that. That's only happened once, but.
yeah. Thank you, Anne. That's
Yeah.
great information. Anne was saying that yellow cabbage collards is a cool variety that from Virginia?
It's from North Carolina.
North Carolina.
And I got it almost by accident.
Yeah.
It's a long story that I won't tell. But when I was going to write something about it, looked it up again, it's now a slow food arc of taste variety.
Oh, nice. Yeah, we love planting collards over winter, and they are exceedingly hardy. We always planted them fairly early in June to get them to size up, but Anne was just saying that you can also plant them in August and get a crop to size up and overwinter well and have good quality. So that is something that we should also try to plant now as soon as you can. But most collard varieties do fairly well. We've always had good success with Champion. It's a classic dark green collard. But yellow cabbage collard from Southern Exposure Seed Exchange is another good source.
They're light colored.
I might try that because we've been looking for a good collard to add, and that's a unique and nice variety.
Good source and good friends too.
Wonderful.
All right. I think what we might do let me see, we were planning on going about a couple of hours, 20 more minutes, say. I think what we might do is just turn conversation a little bit around to one of the sort of deep strategic concerns that Andrew and myself and Chris and other plant stewards in the Pacific Northwest have been concerned about, really ever since we first began to get into winter cropping in earnest. What we found, of course, is that because there's, for a variety of complicated reasons, there's been almost no corporate breeding work done for winter hardiness in crops stateside for 40 or 50 years. A lot of the material that we had, winter hardy material that we had ready access to in the States when we first began looking for varieties that work, was hybrid material. A lot of the rest of the open pollinated material was essentially locked behind seed laws in Europe. So one of the great challenges we encountered right from the start in terms of winter cropping was the fact that we were dealing with a legacy of the fact that people weren't growing food through winters and hadn't been growing food through winters in the Pacific Northwest for much time because it made sense to have it grown by slave labor in Mexico in sunny weather, winter food, was complicated by the fact that corporate breeding trends and other factors made it difficult for us not only to find material, but have some reliance that what material was available was going to continue to be made available to us through the years. In our early days, for example, in terms of conversation with sort of one of the legendary plant breeders in the Pacific Northwest, Tim Peters, he said, look, we're going to lose overwintered, open-pollinated cauliflower material unless we're not careful. And essentially over the course of the last 15 years or so, we've been endeavouring to do our best to arrest that trend, but for the most part, we've lost almost all of it, haven't we? And it's not, to a degree, material that we're going to readily be able to get back. We are invested in open-pollinated material not as a sort of an act of agrarian sentimentalism, not because we're interested in heirlooms per se, but fundamentally because we're interested in crops that possess the inherent capacity to localize, that we can steward and that can adapt to local tastes and local conditions, where hybrid material is designed fundamentally, structurally, genetically, from the ground up, not to be able to do that. Would you like to speak to that topic a little bit more? And Chris, would you be interested in coming up here and maybe taking my place and talking a little bit to the topic of plant stewardship in the Northwest?
Sure.
Yeah, come on up. Chris Mannix is my collaborator, farm mate, cohort, and has more of an active role in hands-on stewardship of plant varieties in the Northwest, so maybe he could have something interesting to say.
Okay. Hello. Chris is here.
Hey. So where should we begin?
Well, I guess we could start with a story of
Story's good.
Leamington winter giant overwintering cauliflower from Leamington Spa, England. We, as my wife Sarah and I were traveling in Europe and England, and we went to the Heritage Seed Library, which is kind of their version of a Seed Savers Exchange. And in their cooler, they had an old packet from 1996 of Leamington winter giant cauliflower, and we planted it. And the first year we planted it in Oregon, it did great. It overwintered, made these beautiful, amazing heads. It surprisingly set seed in the heat in Douglas County, and it did really, really well. And ever since then, we were trying to sell the seed or like give it away at seed swaps to get more people interested in this overwintering cauliflower, because there's only a few other varieties available of overwintering cauliflower. Every time we tried to regrow it, which I think was up to 4 times now, it died for one reason or another, because it's not really the right climate. We got really lucky. It is an incredibly appropriate climate for producing overwintering cauliflower, but not a great climate for producing seed of overwintering cauliflower. To be technical, once the temperature gets into the 80s during pollination, the pollen will desiccate and not, it will pollinate but not fertilize, and you won't get seed. So it's one of those tricky things where it's one of the best crops for us, and if you've never eaten overwintering cauliflower, you're missing out. It tastes like a giant, like dinner platter sized, like cashew. It's amazing. So pretty much we even got a little bit of seed back from England from someone who grew it out once, and we tried to grow it again here and we failed again. Not necessarily anyone's fault, more just challenging climate and very particular crop. But we did find a seed company in England called Tozer's, which had probably a dozen varieties of overwintering cauliflower, one of which was a variety called Prestige, which we found we loved it, we really liked it. It was similar to Leamington in quality, and we encouraged Uprising Seeds in Bellingham, Washington to produce it, and they have a much more appropriate climate. So we do have that one now, and they're producing it and got some really great seed of it. So if you want to try a overwintering cauliflower, that's a good one called Prestige. But over the years, we keep seeing this Tozer's catalog of overwintering open pollinated cauliflowers, and they would drop 5 of them and then add 2 new hybrids. Probably what they did was, or they dropped 4, so they probably chose the 2 parents, inbred them a little bit, crossed them, and then released a hybrid and dropped the OPs. So, and they were the only ones producing seed of those OPs. So these 12 varieties of overwintering cauliflower, let's say, every one was targeted to a different harvest window in the spring. So starting in early April, going through late May, every week or two there'd be a different variety that would head up, like by day length or whatever. And it was incredible, like perfect production plan for months of incredible overwintering cauliflower. Apparently their hybrid program wasn't profitable enough, and they've decided to drop, I think, all of the stuff now. So like there might be only one other company in all of Europe still producing seed of overwintering cauliflower. So it's one of those things where heirloom tomato craze has caused the diversity and available varieties of tomatoes to go through the roof. We went from like 500 in the 80s, we're up to like 4,000 now. It's an incredible increase of diversity availability, but with cauliflower, it's gone through the floor, and it's looking like it might actually even go extinct if just a few people stop growing the seed. So this is an example of how certain things are doing well and other things need stewardship and seed saving and people to produce seed of it. And cauliflower is kind of the totem example of how difficult it can be sometimes, but hopefully we can fix this problem.
Also, there needs to be stewardship outside the Willamette Valley. I mean, it's real neat and cool that Willamette Valley is producing a lot of seed, but it's all the eggs in one basket problem. So the world is relying on the Willamette Valley for so much, and what happens as the climate changes for the Willamette Valley? What happens if there's something really catastrophic that happens in the Willamette Valley, like a giant tsunami that floods the valley or something like that? It just wipe out a ton of things. Then of course, you have more immediate concerns. So in the Willamette Valley, as Andrew talks about quite a bit, that nearly every Finger Valley, or perhaps every Finger Valley, has a GMO sugar beet. And so, and then we have, so that's contamination of beets and chard right there, and that drops a lot of varieties, and it makes it hard. Like you were explaining the trials and tribulations of growing chard in a greenhouse. Chard in a greenhouse the plant doesn't like that.
No.
I mean, from a market gardener perspective, but it's difficult. But from a seed perspective, I've never even tried to take chard out to seed in the greenhouse because I knew it'd be really difficult, but that's reality today. Then we also have to deal with the, and this is just general, we have to deal with the past land use patterns, and in general, in terms of toxics and stuff like that. But in this case, we have to deal with the fact that people planted carrots in the past, and now there's weedy carrot everywhere. And so there are very few places actually in the country or the world, in temperate world, where weedy carrots aren't all over the place. So carrot diversity is dropping off precipitously.
Queen Anne's lace. Yeah, Queen Anne's lace is a feral carrot, not a wild carrot.
Then we have, of course, issues with just general stewardship. There aren't enough people sorting seed varieties, and there aren't enough individuals of that crop type that are going out to seed year in, year out. So the what's called the plasticity, or the way that the genome can flex towards and adapt to new changes, is reduced. And when you have small amounts of individuals that you take out to seed year in, year out, and when that's happening in, say, the Willamette Valley, and then it happens somewhere in Europe, and then it happens somewhere on the East Coast, and then it happens maybe somewhere in a more subtropical environment, and then it comes back to the temperate, it starts to really harm the variety. And so you lose the traits that the variety was known for. You lose the adaptability of the variety. So we're running into that problem. But we really do, I mean, 1.86% of the population is involved in farming. So if you go at a party, you're lucky to have 1 in 50 people that's involved in farming. And so of that,
unless you go to a farmer party,
then the numbers,
awesome.
It turns out higher. Yeah, it's also pretty good. The potluck is better, by the way. You don't show up where it's all plates, forks, and beer. You're like, what am I going to do with this? I can't make anything with this and mustard. It's not possible. Where was I before the potluck? And so of the farmers, of this 1 in 50 people that's a farmer, how many both of us know, all three of us know quite a few farmers. How many do we know that are actually saving seeds? Not a lot. And the people that are doing it are kind of, no offense, but they're often doing it willy-nilly. And that's not to say that I don't do things willy-nilly sometimes by the seat of my pants, Sometimes you just do something and it worked. And so you're like, this is a little wonky, but it worked. So I'll save the seeds. But we don't have very many people at all, gardeners or farmers saving seeds. And I wouldn't even take a gander at 1 out of whatever people in this country are saving seeds, but the number's really low. And so we don't have enough. We don't have enough people storing enough varieties. Another problem is that some variety comes on the scene, like say glass gem corn, and it's all the rage. And so everybody drops every other corn that they had and starts growing glass gem. And then pretty soon, 5 years rolls down the line, and we've lost a bunch of corn, because the next great thing came along after glass gem. And so we're just having this erasure of varieties. And I think it really speaks to the issues of lack of permanence. We're still living in kind of the echoes of the manifest destiny colonizer culture or lack of culture. And so, this idea that we're not a part of the landscape, if we F something up, we'll just move somewhere else, kind of ideal. Just not very ideal. So, the deeper aspects, it goes down a rabbit hole, but there's deeper aspects to all this and why we're just losing why we've already lost things like cauliflower. We've already lost the old huge storage carrots. Almost all of those are gone, We have already lost almost all the sugar beet varieties,
So
almost
Chris,
all the Bangel varieties, etc.
What do you see as possible opportunities in seed stewardship?
One of the possible keeping it positive. We're going to keep it positive here today. Yeah, we're going to bring it back. Making positive great again. We're going to make positive great again here. So one of the advantages is to always be on the lookout. Go learn from your elders. There are people that have become decrepit, but yet have some varieties stored, and they're really eager to pass them on. And they may not germinate, or they may germinate. There's various old seed techniques to get things to germinate, and it basically means giving the plant a little extra enzymes or amino acids. One of them is a green tea or a black tea treatment. But there's various methods. Some people use multivitamins with seeds to give them a little boost, give the embryo a little bit extra juice. Because sometimes a lot of the surrounding tissue of the seed is dead, but the embryo is still alive. So if it gets enough nutrients, it can come back with a lot of pampering. Another thing, too, is to not abuse the gene banks, but because the gene banks are susceptible to abuse, and I see a lot of that online, like, I can get free seeds from the USDA. But there is a lot of mining to be done over the next few decades of the material at IPK Gattersleben, which is a major gene bank that people, just regular people, actually have access to for a small fee, sometimes a large fee. And the USDA, which is free of charge for the most part. But that's one way that we can recover a lot of stuff, is to mine out the gene banks. And the information about what these particular varieties are often sparse, so it's kind of it's a detective game. You're mining old documents to try to find information about what are these name descriptors, what these name descriptors in these gene banks actually mean. Sometimes you don't know what they mean, and you just request 20 varieties that appear to be okay, or maybe they just had a cool name, and you find a bunch that work really well, or one that works really well, or none, and you try another 20 or something like that, and you report back your results. So that's one way that we can recover some of this diversity.
So, Andrew, what could farmers, if farmers are interested in actually participating actively in an effort to support and strengthen or maintain or improve upon winter hardy genetics in the Pacific Northwest, what are the steps they can be taking?
Well, I would like to. So Nick was saying, what could farmers do to start stewarding seeds or improve the winter hardiness and availability of different varieties and quality?
Nash Huber being a classic.
Yeah, Nash up in Sequim, Washington has stewarded a few varieties, and his carrots are legendary, and there's a lot of cool stuff that he's done. But a lot of farmers get into this because their favorite varieties get dropped commercially, and they want to start saving seed. Anne is a great example of someone who's saved seed and even bred some new varieties, released them, open source seed initiative, which is pretty cool. And so there's a lot of farmers that are doing this, but it is not so many. It'd be cool if there were more. I like to say not just farmers, but anyone that is a serious gardener or homesteader that has some space to plant 100 plants of cauliflower or 200 plants because they need more space. Those stewardship opportunities are a lot of people could start, but usually what I would encourage a farmer to do is first start with their trials, because most farmers have trialed a lot of varieties, and they have their trial protocol where they'll plant 4 varieties of carrots or 10 varieties of spinach and see which one they like best. First would be sourcing some varieties, either from some odd seed companies like us, or online, find some people that want to share seed, or USDA might send them some seed if they can state their project goals. Say, I want to start stewarding a variety, I would like to try these 10 varieties of buckwheat, and I'll report back, and I'm going to choose 1 or 2 to cross and start my own breeding project. They're usually totally cool with that, as long as you have some kind of breeding goal or project. You can get stuff through the Seed Savers Exchange yearbook, different seed companies that have more, if they produce the seed or are transparent of who they grew the seed, you can get some of that good seed going. But really, it's start with a big swath of opportunity and see which one stuff is best, and then start selecting from there. And really, all it takes is letting it go past production stage and growing the seed out, and selecting for what you like, and only letting the plants flower that you like, and getting rid of any plants that are really bad actors or have traits that you don't want. It's a very simple process that all of our ancestors participated in.
I'd like to say just one thing about that. In while you're doing that process, and when you've honed in on a variety that you really like, try to get it from everywhere. Try to get it from, use Facebook too. Use all the resources you can to get as many different strains, or at least sources of that variety, and evaluate them all against each other. Do a trial of all those. And I generally try to let a few of the different strains come back together, because each of those generally represent a bottleneck that's occurred, a genetic bottleneck that's occurred. But be careful when you do that, because you're more likely to find off types, outcrossings, so that the variety just isn't pure anymore. And so you want to make sure that you maintain quality. But when you can do that, and you can create a stock population of like a synthesis of multiple different strains, and they might all appear to be phenotypically the same. They might all have the same appearance, but in the woodwork, there are differences. So you can select those after a few.
The genome that you can't see.
Yeah. After a few generations, you can select that, and I've been able to create an increased amount of vigor that was seeming to be lost from an older variety that once I grew and stepped away from that variety for a while and came back and said, in a market garden setting, and said like, this is not the same variety. What the heck happened? And so anyway, that's just another strategy.
And to bring it back to specifically to a winter focus.
Yes.
What can with regard to winter crop stewardship?
Winter crop stewardship.
Yeah.
One thing about winter crop stewardship, it's the same issue with all stewardship, but even more salient with winter crops, is to celebrate the struggle and the difficulties. The more harsh your climate, the more challenging the situation is, the colder the frost was, the more plants that die, the more opportunity there is to change and adapt and achieve a new status quo that might be better, and then do that cycle again. So Joseph Lofthouse is a plant breeder in Utah. His climate's really, really harsh. And he crosses up 100 things or 10 things, depending on the crop, and lets them cross-pollinate, and he sees who survives. And if 90% of it dies and 10% survives, he's pretty happy. He's got opportunity. He can go somewhere. And some of his stuff that he's released is really unique and really hardy and really
beyond everything else.
If you grew it on the coast of California and Salinas and steward it there in its perfect, ideal climate where it just loves to grow and you barely have to do anything, there's no reason for that plant to struggle and adapt and change. And so there is opportunity in struggle. And being a steward of a variety, it's really an interesting reframe of the challenges in life to see how things can adapt and make a future new level of health from a challenge like that.
And speaking to Joseph Lofthouse, sometimes, in particular, he's been working on this winter pea project, planting peas at the total wrong time and in mass, and has got back very little material. And this year, he's finally eventually kind of reach a critical turning point where you are able to do an increase often, and it will just kind of, I've noticed this with a number of selections, you'll just get tiny bit of material back for a number of years, but if you stockpile that and then all grow that all together, sometimes it can just really expand. And one thing about adaptation that Andrew was talking about, if you have a year where you grow out a larger number of individuals and it's a bad year and you have only a few survive, that's actually a really good selection event to gather that seed up, and that cross of those hardy individuals is going to be very precious material. And one thing though is to not just continue with the descendants of that material, but to grow the original stock material that you had, and to keep growing that out and allowing that really diverse or that really honed in focused material that survived to cross to the wider, more diverse material. And that way you maintain plasticity or the flexibility of the genome to adapt, and you basically expand those traits that you selected for disease resistance, or in this case winter hardiness, or maintenance of flavor, or maintenance of integrity, marketability in poor conditions, and you slowly expand that out into your main population. And then one other thing I want to say in regards to selection is try to grow out a lot of individuals, and sometimes even grow them out at a little tighter spacing than they should be, where you actually begin to rogue them out pretty early on. That's pretty helpful. And then also, if it's a crop that you can straddle between growing, if it's say an annual like lettuce, and you only have a little bit of seed, try to first grow that out in the summer and get a crap ton of seed. That then you can have a huge number of individuals go into the winter, because some of these things, a lot of these things they just quote unquote arrived in the valley, it's the first time that we're working with them personally. So we may not know the full parameters. We never really know the full parameters of how something's going to survive to all the unknowns that it's going to be subjected to. So it's good to have a big stock of something rare if you can, you know. And
Can I just say this is a winter cropping workshop? Could we bring that conversation back to how it relates specifically
Yes.
to winter crops?
And again, I think I am being pretty specific about if you're growing for winter cropping, grow that variety out if you can in the summer, you know, during the summer months, so you can get a big pile of seed that then you can later on in a subsequent season grow that through the winter and have many individuals and not lose it, you know, not totally lose it if you fail going through the winter. Also, if you can't do that, then grow it under super pampered conditions the first couple times till you have a big seed increase. Then you never grow all your seed is the other thing too. So you can have a big pile of seed to work with and fail a couple times at it.
Well, a lot of overwintering crops are outcrossing, outbreeding, cross-pollinating species. And I don't know if it was originally a John Navazio quote, but he was saying that you never really know a cross-pollinating variety until you've grown out 200 to 400 plants and see what the potential of the crop is. Because there's always something, there might be a little bit of recessive that pops out here and there, and just being able to see that much material can really help you make choices to be a better seed steward. And you might find an opportunity in that, like that needle in the haystack, which could lead to something really special. And that is, and when you stress things out, like taking them through winter, you start to see different reactions from the different phenotypes that wouldn't have been as obvious if you were to grow them in a pampered condition. So make sure you have enough seed stock. Like we like to source a lot of seeds from Chiltern Seed in England because they have some cool OP varieties of brassicas and like a bunch of stuff that you can't really get here. And they're one of the few companies that will ship seeds here, but they only ship like 50 seeds or 20 seeds at a time. So I'm buying like 30 pounds worth of one variety of seed. It's like, oh, that's not 30 pounds. What is that? That's like almost $60 or whatever. It's a lot of money for like just enough seed to plant 200 plants to then stave seed and get some good genomes started to do some selection work from. So if you're going to be a seed steward, there's a lot of these little things to learn. So it's like never-ending interest when it comes to the depth that you can go. There's the winter gardening is super rich and super fascinating and super complicated. There's almost no end to that. But when you start to become a seed saver, into a seed steward, and then into a plant breeder, it's like a lifetime of possible nerding out and exciting, fun times. And there's a lot of people that get excited about doing that, and there's a great community and very welcoming. But I would like to say that if you're just getting into seed saving, if you find a variety that you like over winter and you want to save seed, the Seed Garden, which was published by the Seed Savers Exchange, is a newer publication that is excellent. And it is thick, it's got beautiful photos, really good information about how to be a seed steward and save seed. It's kind of like the joy of cooking. There's recipes in here, and if you follow them, you'll probably succeed. I like to say it's easier to save seed than it is to bake a cake. Sometimes you just have to wait longer.
And I might also say that we're not one of the great sort of initiations that happens as one moves more deeply into life, really, occurs when we start rolling seed saving into our experience of the agroecological life. It carries us into, in a sense, a continuum, a realm of
We just got esoteric.
It carries us into a deepening that not only complicates the outer approach. For example, a classic example would be one of the challenges of winter cropping is that it means that we have crops in the ground for a very long time over the course of the year. this creates an increased need to focus more specifically on and more carefully and more reverentially, to a degree, on soil stewardship, cover cropping, letting ground rest, feeding soil becomes far more salient a concern the longer you have crops in the ground, the more ground you have exposed through winter, for example. Immediately, in a sense, there's a deepening of your ecological conscience that's a natural outgrowth of moving into winter cropping and moving into seed saving, where the crops are in the ground for an even longer period of time. So there's an immense sort of quality of life advance that happens when we move into stewarding these essential crops, that not only involves the sort of pedestrian functional requirement of making sure that we're actually going to have food that works for us in the decades ahead, but also brings our lives into sort of deeper dimensions of integrity, realness, depth, and beauty.
Where do we go from here?
That can't be followed.
Maybe it's time. It's probably time.
I could just do a quick roundup of some potential sources that I recommend. A lot of what we've been saying is like good tips that we found helpful, and some personal truths that are not really true because they'll probably change in the next decade as things change. But there are some really great resources out there for winter gardening and winter farming. We always like to start with the classic book by Elliot Coleman, Four-Season Harvest, which is like one of the original winter farming textbooks in a way. Lots of good ideas in there.
From Maine.
Yeah, his Winter Harvest Handbook is also pretty good. It is from Maine, where they have lots of sunlight but a lot of cold, so it's a completely reversed kind of production system, but you can learn from outside methods and figure out how to apply them locally or in your own climate. Here, the book that got me originally excited about winter gardening was this book, Winter Gardening in the Maritime Northwest by Binda Colebrook, and it got recently republished. And it's kind of a good introduction to winter gardening. It's easy to read, lots of tips, some fun stuff to go with. More of a gardening scale, and newbie, good people who've not gotten into it yet. It's a really good source. Growing Vegetables West of the Cascades by Steve Solomon is also a classic in the area that has some good tips. He has some really strong opinions about things, which are surprisingly correct most of the time, but not all the time. It depends on your conditions and your goals and your situation. Just like all of this, take it as great feedback and great knowledge to possibly tweak and figure out what you're going to do with it. And it's usually different how you're gonna go forward, but it's really fun to just absorb all of this information, entertain it in your mind and your own farm, and then create some of your own protocols and then adapt those protocols further into the future. It's really exciting and never-ending fun. There's also a lot of great seed catalogs that have some great seed sources. So, let me see if I can see them so I don't forget them. Wild Garden Seeds is a great source for good winter material. Siskiyou Seeds down in Southern Oregon. Nichols, they're in Albany, just down the road from here. They source some pretty unique varieties sometimes that are really cool and worth checking out. The classic standby companies like Johnny's, Territorial, and High Mowing, and Fedco, and Osborne, more for commercial growers. These companies, you'll find some stuff in there sometimes, and they tend to keep them in the catalog for a while. But most of what they have is for summer production and the stuff that works nationally. So Territorial still has a few varieties that grow especially well here, but they are also a national company in addition to that. So just knowing that background, that you don't assume that what they have is exactly right for you, but it's a good place to start because their seeds tend to be relatively high quality for germination and purity. Is there any other?
Fruition Seeds.
Fruition Seeds has some good stuff in the Northeast. Turtle Tree was one of the first companies that told you who grew the seed in the catalog. Most companies just repackage other people's seeds and put their label on it. Turtle Tree started a revolution and started telling people where their seed was sourced from, the farmer that grew it, the latitude and longitude, even the animals that create the fertility on the farm. They even told you all. They kind of went like off really, really deep with it.
West Coast seeds.
West Coast seeds
BC.
in British Columbia. They still carry some good European varieties and have some great material as well.
Mixed bag with Irish eyes, but there's some good stuff there.
Yeah, most seed companies have a great.
They're out of Washington.
There's some good material, but you get to know like the source of so like for example, Baker Creek is an incredible resource for getting a new variety that no one else has. That's really rare from Europe, from Eastern Europe, from Asia, from the USDA gene banks. And you take it as a seed steward and you grow it out, and it's totally crossed up and it's totally low vigor. And you do a little bit of selection work for 2 seasons in a row, and it is all of a sudden a really good variety for the area and even for farm production. So what we like to do is take USDA and Baker Creek and other Seed Savers Exchange varieties that are really not in the best condition but have high potential, and then make them a little bit better quality. It's kind of a fun practice to do as a seed steward as well. So that's where you can get great material to get started. Seed Savers Exchange Yearbook is a good source as well, but risky sometimes.
An Irish company called Seedaholic, which will ship here.
Oh, Seedaholic ships here.
Seedaholic is great, yeah. But expensive.
It's
good.
expensive, but if you just want a few to get started,
Yeah, that's a cool source as well.
and you just want a lottery or something.
Chris, would you thank our hosts here today?
Yes. Thank you, Julia and Robin.
And the chart.
And Jack for tech stuff.
Yeah. Thank you, Tech Jack. And the speakers and everything. This is great.
And the rooster off in the distance.
We have a seed saving zine, like a very basic seed saving zine PDF on the seedambassadors.org website, and also the winter gardening chart is there as well. And hopefully we'll republish this soon and turn it into a zine as well for all the punk rockers.
What's
out
also
there.
that one that Don Tipping redid recently for Siskiyou Seeds? It's like he's published it the last couple of years on Facebook, but
I haven't seen that.
it's just it's based on an older calendar of vegetables. I'm trying to think of what it's called. Oh, and one other resource too is though you need to watch the dates a little bit, and some of the varieties are no longer available. But it's the Seattle Tilth Maritime Growing Guide, and there's actually 2 different versions of it, and both are actually quite good. And give you some. It's a good just year-round gardening calendar, but there's some precious winter stuff. Like they have one crop that is a weed that is wonderful, very nutritious, and very medicinally active is chickweed, for instance. And they talk a lot about the chickweed.
Chickweed is tasty.
All right, can we want to say farewell, gentlemen, and
Nick, you got to come over here and say farewell too.
All right.
This
It's really
this is your
it's not
event.
Chris and Andrew,
I'll-
it's Nick and Andrew. So
I can
I'll
cut
step
off.
away.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Nick.
yeah,
And thank you all in the whatever.
yeah, and we would encourage you to continue this conversation around Facebook. One of the things that we're finding in our particular corner of paradise is that perhaps it's simply timely, perhaps it's simply a symptom of our age, but the farmers are beginning to gather and are beginning to organize. And this conversation about how to steward our own lives and the food culture that we are elementally a part of is becoming. You're also being led to join with your fellow farmers and talk about these things and begin to collaborate on projects together.
So if we might stick around and answer a couple questions, but if there are questions on the feed, you can post on the post and ask